Hello, everyone. My name is Richard Ali, and I'm a novelist from Nigeria. And I would like to talk to you about the novel Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. Chinua Achebe, as you know, is a Nigerian writer. And Professor TJ tells me that you've been reading the book. So I'm happy that Nigeria and India are getting to talk through the pages of Chinua Achebe's novel Things Fall Apart. Things Fall Apart is a very interesting and a very important book, both in terms of African literature and in terms of world literature, for one salient reason, which is colonialism. Most of the countries in Africa, with the exception of Ethiopia and Liberia, were colonized by the West, Britain, Germany, and so on, just like the whole continent of India was colonized by the British majorly, even though there are certain parts that had earlier Portuguese settlements like Goa and all of that. But in the case of Nigeria, uh, the colonialism was done by the British. And the thing with colonialism was that it was believed that Africans were backwards. Prior to colonialism, there had been a slave trade in which Africans had been exported across the country to the Americas and elsewhere. So everything about Africa was felt to be inferior, was felt to be dark. The cultures of Africa, the languages of Africa, the very personality of the African was felt to be inferior to the Ethiopian. Hence the need to be colonized. And a corollary of the colonialization is the civilization of Africans. You have to pause to imagine this. People who have been living on a continent for thousands of years, and suddenly Europe comes and says they need to be civilized. And they decided to colonize us for that. Same thing with India. Now, what really happened in terms of colonialism was they wanted to make the African a European, basically. They forced European culture onto the African because they had already agreed amongst themselves that African cultures were primitive and barbaric and whatnot. And this led to a whole lot of literature, which created Africa as a dark continent. Now the thing is, if you have somebody you wish to exploit, maybe you want to steal somebody's land or vegetables or whatever, the first way to do it is to tell everybody that this person is a bad person. Therefore, he does not deserve to have those lands or vegetables or whatever it is. Then it makes the process of acquiring those things easier. And that's exactly what the British did. Now, culture is a very dynamic thing, and literature is a part of culture. And colonialism was essentially a cultural enterprise. Civilization was a cultural enterprise. And there had become this literature about the Dark Continent, principally by someone called Joseph Conrad. He's an amazing writer, an absolutely brilliant writer who wrote a book called The Heart of Darkness, which was very well written book. You actually all should read it, but it sought to create a binary where the rivers in Africa, which is the River Congo, is dark and threatening and barbaric and primitive. Yet the same river, which is really the same water, whether it's in Europe, is somehow given a different theme. So African school children grew up on books like this, which demeaned them, which put them in a sort of place where they were savages and all of that. So this is why Chinua Achebe's book is so important. Chinua Achebe's novel was the first time or the first major occasion of an African writer writing back at the West. So he decided, no, 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 wait a minute. My people have lived here for thousands of years and they have a culture, they have beliefs, they have festivals that that they have evolved in gods that they believe in, just like the Hindu gods in your country and the Tamil gods and so on and so forth. So he decided, since they have us this bad in the books, where I'm going to write a book which is going to answer Europe. And that's what Things Fall Apart is about. So, Things Fall Apart is essentially the story of Okonkwo, who lives in the village of Omofia, and he goes through his life under the shadow of his father, who Unoka. Unoka was a bit of a wastrel and a no good sort of person. So, Okonkwo wants to be a man of repute in his society, and he's afraid of weakness in every form. He doesn't want to be like his father. And it is exactly this desire to be somebody, this desire to make a name for oneself, that sees Okonkwo go on to his tragedy. Now, this is the simple story, but in telling the story, Chinua Achebe is able to give us an insight into Igbo society at the turn of the century, at the time that the white man was just coming to Africa. And in doing this, he's able to show us the complexity of the cultures that came to be destroyed by the white man. They had their days, they had their market days, they had their chieftaincy institutions, they had their codes of what was good conduct, what was not good conduct. So, in writing this book, Achebe wanted to make an argument for indigenous Africans as being worthy of their dignity. And when this book was published in 1958, it changed everything. And the sort of study that it inaugurated is called Africana Studies. And books that came after that tend to be classed under Africana Studies even up till today. So it's basically about the study of Africa. So that's about it about the book and the motivations of the writer and what he set out to achieve. You've all read the book, so I'm not going to delay so much on talking about it. So I'll go right back into your questions that you sent to me, and then I'll try to give brief uh, answers to them. So I have 10 questions in front of me, and I'll try to take them one by one. And it may be that in answering one question, I'll answer another one. So we'll make our way through. So the first question is: are the cultural practices mentioned in the novel currently being practiced? To an extent, culture is a dynamic thing. So culture tends to change based on new information that you have, new techniques of doing things, new ways of organizing your life. So culture tends to change. So cultures are not static. So, in one form or the other, some of those cultural practices that exist in the novel still exist in Nigeria, in southeastern Nigeria, which is where the novel was set. For example, the very elaborate rites of kinship, of chieftaincy, whether it's the Offa title or the Ozo title, and then the republican nature of the Igbo people of southeastern Nigeria, where a man can rise to any level. It's not an aristocratic system generally. You are able to go as far as you can go, as far as you and your personal ambition and your luck is able to take you. So these practices continue. But then there is like the practice of the Osu, the case system, which okay, or the issue of like the killing of Ikemefuna. Those practices have been outlawed by the Nigerian government, and generally these do not happen anymore. In instances where ritual sacrifice happen, they are illegal. And if the government catches up with the people who do these things, then they're in a whole lot of trouble. So it's not like the way it used to be back then before we had a proper government, like a national government. The second question is, has westernization affected African culture? What have been the changes created? Yes, of course, westernization has affected African culture. Westernization has affected all cultures, whether it's Indian, whether it's Japanese, whether it's, I mean, okay, consider you go to Tokyo today and everybody is wearing a suit, often than not, or you go to India, parts of India, and the tea drinking tradition, which is essentially British, and right now we cannot distinguish it. And the most important thing, which is in terms of westernization, is that most of us speak a Western language. I speak English as my first language. And when I wake up in the morning, I think in English. The language in which I dream is English. And that is the case for a whole lot of people. And even my sensibilities tend to be English sensibilities modified by my own African experience. So, yes, westernization has affected African culture. I like to think that we have taken the things that are beneficial from the West and added it to what we have and created a sort of synthesis. But sometimes the ideology behind Western thinking and the ideology behind African thinking, in terms of, say, timeliness, in terms of the relationship between younger people and older people, is different. And this has always led to conflicts between being an African who is educated in the Western or the European sense of it. So we're basically products of Western education, Western philosophy, and the Western way of life, even if we ourselves are not Europeans. Now, the third question is, how would you describe Okonkwo as a character? I think what makes Okonkwo an interesting character is that he's a well-rounded character. This is somebody who was born, who has always liked to assert himself, who wants to be the very, very best that he can be, who wants more than that to be recognized in the society as somebody who is something, somebody who is to be reckoned with. Yet at the same time, this admirable character has a huge temper. And in this temper, side by side with his fear of being seen as weak by anybody at all, leads him to do things that ultimately lead to his end, such as the killing of Ikemefuna. For example, a character says, that boy calls you father, do not have a hand in his death. Yet at that critical moment, Okonkwo is one of the people who raises a knife a cutlass to kill Ikemefuna because he doesn't want to be considered as a weak person by the others, and he does this really abominable thing. The same thing when he takes up a gun and shoots and kills somebody, and he has to be banished from Umofia to his mother's village. So these are the these this I think Okonkwo's character is very relatable because he has ambitions, but he also has flaws, and the entire story is of how these ambitions fight against his flaws and what happens. A story is a tragedy when those flaws gain the upper hand. A story is not a tragedy when the good nature of a character triumphs over the adversities and then the opposition that they face. So I think that's about it about Okonkwo as a character. He's a deeply flawed character, but he's a complex character. And that's why people are able to relate to the character all over the world. Things Fall Apart has been printed in over 40 different languages. So, what is the relevance of the novel today? Yeah, I would say that the relevance of the novel today would be to remind us that the West did not bring everything to Africa or to India or to elsewhere, and that we have over time evolved our own indigenous cultures, and that these cultures deserve to be celebrated, and that we came from somewhere, that we exist in history, and that we have also done historical things. So, the idea of Africa being a dark continent or black people being less than human, which is what racist thinking in the West enjoins us to believe, is wrong. So I would say that the relevance of the novel today is that it reaffirms the vitality of an African identity. In order to understand this situation, you must imagine, with being Indians, if when the British came, they decided that all things Indian, indigenously Indian, were evil. The Hindu religion or Tamil religion, all those gods or chieftaincies or customs were all taught as being barbaric and they should be suppressed in favor of a thoroughly English way of life. So the relevance is that it reminds us that we were not always underdogs and that we also created culture. Yeah, the issue of identity crisis. I would say the beauty with Things Fall Apart is that it's endlessly able to speak to many things that happen today. The beauty of the novel is that it's endlessly interpretable, so that a character like Okonkwo, you can understand him in terms of identity crisis. Maybe if you had let him alone, maybe what he really wanted to do would just be to be a farmer and all of that. But he feels that it is important that he compensates for the weakness of his father by becoming a great man, and this becomes his sole ambition. And he's not a bad person, yet he finds himself, in order to get what he thinks he should want, doing things that are not what he should do. And this is the core of the crisis. So in terms of identity crisis, I like to think that this is the same situation that we find ourselves in. I am speaking English to you, you all speak English, yet none of us is English. I am not English, you are not English. So why is it that English is the language in which we dream, in which we think, in which we express ourselves? Now, the publishing of Things Fall Apart led to a very important debate in African writing between Chinua Achebe and a Kenyan writer named Ngugi wa Thiong'o on what should be the language of African writing. Can we be writing African writing in European languages like English and German? Or should African writing be written in indigenous African languages? And this debate continues up till today. And no side has won, as it were. And I write in English. I have a novel and I wrote it in English because it's the language I'm most comfortable with. But I think that what we do with the English language is we have made it our own. We are using the English language to tell our stories the way we want because it is the language we have the most facility. So in that sense, I can say that English has become an African language, at least for the purpose of writing and getting our thoughts across. Uh, okay, the next question is, why did Achebe choose this particular title for the book? The title actually came from a poem by William Butler Yeats. I think his name is pronounced Yeats. And the lines are turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot heed the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon the earth. So it's from a poem. But the thing is, the particular reason why why he chose this phrase is because the world of Okonkwo, the world of Africa, before the arrival of the white man, had become destroyed by the arrival of the white man. So all the things did fall apart. And Africa has had to be recreated anew, a new sense of culture, a new sense of everything. So everything did fall apart. But in terms of where he got the title from, it's from a poem. But then it also resonates with with the destruction of African cultural life in favor of the colonized, civilized life that we are all descendants of. What is unique culturally about Things Fall Apart, and how did Things Fall Apart influence society? Things Fall Apart has influenced society, particularly since now you know that you can also write. Writing is not something that is done by white men who live in Europe. But you, as an African, if you have a story to tell, you can get your computer out and type and write your story. So Things Fall Apart reminded everybody that Africans have stories and that they also have a right to tell them, and that Africans are a part of global culture, as it were. And that's been the major influence. Other writers have written numerous books, right up to Chimamanda Adichie, Helen Habila, Abubakar Adam Ibrahim, and so many other novelists who have come up since then. So you can say, in that sense, Achebe is the father figure of African literature, and he was the first who did that. What is unique culturally about Things Fall Apart? Things Fall Apart tells a specific story of an ethnic group set in an ethnic group in Nigeria. So Africa is a continent of about 54 countries. The Igbo parts of Nigeria, where the book is set, is one of perhaps 500 ethnic groups in Nigeria. So it's just a small part of Africa. So there's no such thing as all African culture. There's just an aspect of it. So I think the most unique thing about Things Fall Apart in terms of culture are the proverbs. The proverbs that Achebe uses and to code wisdom in the book. At one point, he says that Proverbs is the oil with which Igbos eat words. And there's another one I like the most, which is uh, let the eagle perch, let the hawk perch also. If one says no to the other, let his wing break. Meaning that we should all try to get along, we should all make accommodations for each other. So I think the most unique thing would be the extensive use of proverbs there. Uh, okay, I like this question. Why does the novel end with the district commissioner musing about the book he's writing? You see, this is the thing. Europe came and destroyed African culture, and then they said they were going to. Then you had actors who had participated in the destruction of these cultures, and then turned around as anthropologists to write about these cultures. And this, the sort of book that the district commissioner was writing would have been the sorts of books that people like Chinua Achebe grew up reading. And these were books that put the African in a very poor light, that looked at him as a savage or somebody who was uncultured. So in this sense, Achebe is talking about how even the narrative of Africa has been taken away from African hands. And he's reiterating, of course, how his book is a claiming back, a taking back of the narrative and the importance of storytelling back from the West. So I think that's what that musing is about. So that's about it with your questions. I hope you enjoy reading the book, and it would be nice if you could write reviews or your thoughts about it. So, Chinua Achebe died a few years ago, so it's not. He was already an old man by the time he died. He was about 70 something years old. But it's good to know that the book that he wrote in 1958, so long ago, is still being read in India and all over the world, and it still is able to create conversation between Africans and Asians and Indians and the whole world. I think that's the importance of books. Books are able to transport us to other cultures. When I read Arundhati Roy or Anita Desai or the guy who wrote White Tiger, or even Rabindranath Tagore or any of those other Indian writers, it gives me a claim, it gives me an idea about Indian people and Indian culture. So, in the same way, when you read Chinua Achebe, it gives you an idea about some cultures in Nigeria. And I think this is the most important thing about literature. So, I hope you enjoy your class and I hope you continue to enjoy African writing. I hope you go out there and buy more African books so that if I ever come to India, we could sit down and have a discussion about it. How about that? So, thank you very much to Professor Tina Jose for inviting me to give this video cast and have fun. Thank you very much. Bye bye.